All right, ladies and gentlemen. So today we're going to talk about our last African-centered topic of the school year, a topic that we've kind of covered the basis of previously to set up this lesson, and that's the topic of apartheid in South Africa. Now, when we last talked about South Africa back in our unit on imperialism, we kind of highlighted how South Africa had a very different history compared to the rest of the continent. That you basically had white settlement there in the form of the Dutch Boers, who were brought to what was then called Cape Colony, basically to resupply ships for the Dutch East India Company traveling to modern day Indonesia. And of course, the big issue, especially, was the need for fresh fruits. Vegetables to ward off diseases like scurvy. The Boers, then we highlighted, how they basically eventually come into conflict with a lot of the native peoples of South Africa, especially a group called the Zulu. There's a number of conflicts that ensue, and that the Boer economy for hundreds of years very much relied on the institution of slavery to farm and herd these vast swaths of territory. In part because of this early history, what develops among Boer culture is a very kind of racially prejudicial mindset, where African native peoples were viewed as lesser to them, and this ideology or this viewpoint very much carries over well into the 20th century. Now, where we kind of left off our story in that previous lesson then was in 1910, after the Boer Wars. You have the creation of a new state, a country called the Dominion of South Africa, which combined a lot of these old tribal lands with the three conquered Boer republics, and it combined those together with British Cape Colony. Of course, the British had taken control back in 1815. So this map just kind of shows us then the boundaries of the Dominion of South Africa as created, and then the original South African flag, which existed up until 1994. And you can see how this flag incorporates both, the Dutch flag and Dutch national colors, the British flag, as well as the flags of some of these previous Boer republics. Now, in this newly created Dominion of South Africa, the overwhelming majority of white peoples there were of Boer descent. Something like 2/3 were Boer, or what was oftentimes called Afrikaner. The remainder were primarily people that were of British descent. And so as a result, that whole racially biased viewpoint very much from the beginning kind of becomes entrenched in government policy. Whites were the only people that were permitted to have a vote and participate politically whatsoever. Whites basically owned all the land. Whites had the best jobs. But we don't see this racial prejudice really become formal government policy until 1948. In 1948, you had a national election in which a very Afrikaner nationalist racist party by the name of the National Party was elected with an overwhelming majority into office. And this party was headed by the man that you see pictured here, the guy who really becomes the architect of apartheid, a man by the name of D.F. Malan. Now, when we talk about, the apartheid era of South African history, then generally what we're talking about is this time period then from 1948 until about 1994. So about 50 years or so, in which really, you could say that racial segregation becomes kind of the number one priority of the South African government, and it really dictated kind of all facets of life. In fact, if you take this word apartheid that was chosen, literally it translates to mean apartness. That we want to break down society, that we want to separate the races, and that we want to minimize contact between the races as much as humanly possible. So, of course, there's definitely a lot of parallels in South Africa during the 20th century as to what was experienced in the American Deep South prior to the civil rights movement. Same kind of mass segregation. Now, when I'm talking about apartheid, one thing I want you to understand is that apartheid wasn't a single law. Rather, it was a series of hundreds and hundreds of laws that were passed over decades and decades. And I put up here just on this slide, three of the most profound early laws. So you see, as early as 1949, something called the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act, which outlawed any kind of fraternization whatsoever amongst the races. So you couldn't date somebody of a different race. You couldn't be friends with somebody of a different race. In this law, also punished white people that violated. So if you're a white Afrikaner, but you said, you know what, I know this kid down the street, and yeah, he's black, but he's a friend of mine, and you were seeing him playing with them or hanging out with them or maybe dating a sister or whatever, you too could be fined or imprisoned for violating this law. You see, second one, their Population Registration Act of 1950. So basically what they did was they set up these massive kind of like racial categorization boards all across the country, and you'd have to come forward with all sorts of documentation as to your lineage, and you were then classified as being one of four different categories of people. You had the whites, so if you could prove that you were of pure-blood white descent, going back grandparents, great-grandparents, okay, you're white. You had the Asians, which were primarily of people of Indian descent who had been brought by the British to work in the mines and work in the fields during the late 1800s and early 1900s. Of course, Gandhi, we looked at, was an example of one of these people that had came over, worked in South Africa for a period of time, and then left. You then had a third group of people that were called the coloreds, and the coloreds were people of mixed descent, or people that maybe couldn't prove, their lineage. To kind of figure out who was colored and who was not colored, there was all sorts of kind of weird, bizarre pseudoscience that was oftentimes employed. For example, if you were somebody that was maybe lighter skin, but you had certain black features, what they would oftentimes do is they would take a pencil and they would put it in your hair. And if the pencil just kind of quickly fell to the ground and moved through your hair, well, then you were considered white. But if you were somebody that they put the pencil in and it stayed in your hair, oftentimes you were then categorized as a colored. And then finally, the last category of people, of course, were the blacks, which made up something like 75% of the overall population. Now, one main reason why this categorization was so important then is that depending on how you were classified dictated where you could live in South Africa. And you see in 1950, there's something called the Group Areas Act that was created, which set aside territories called either townships or homelands where non-whites were forced to live. Now, the difference between the two is that a township was generally located, in an area of a major city, because they recognized the fact that, hey, we need non-whites to work, manual labor jobs and low-paying jobs. So you're going to need some living in proximity. And then homelands were areas generally in more rural areas. And oftentimes these homelands, were in the worst environmental and geographic locations. They were oftentimes up in the mountains, or they were on the fringe of the Kalahari Desert. And overall, something like 17% of the overall territory in South Africa was set up as homelands or townships. So again, 75%, plus you got probably another 10% of Asian and coloreds crammed into a very small percentage of the overall territory. And then the way that, the separation was then enforced was through a series of laws that were just kind of nicknamed the pass laws, where every single person was required to carry with them on their person at all times a pass book stipulating their race. So if you were out at night and you weren't in a township, you'd oftentimes be stopped by a police officer. He would see that, okay, you're assigned to this township, and you're a colored, and you would then be punished as a result. So just a picture of one of these passes, and then this map here shows us again where all of the homelands were located in South Africa, and so you can see the vast, overwhelming majority of the country, especially a lot of these really nice kind of coastal areas here, were set aside solely for white land ownership and white settlement. So it really creates a lot of major long-term problems because, frankly, after apartheid ends, it's not like most of the non-white peoples can all of a sudden just pack up and move from these townships and homelands. A lot of these people, still live in these areas today because economically they don't have the ability to move out and improve their lives. And as a result, these homelands are oftentimes some of the most high poverty, high crime areas located anywhere on Earth. So it still continues to be a lot of economic inequalities in that country today. Again, just some basic pictures of what would have been the normal occurrences all over the country during this 50-year period. So this whole different facility thing that we saw in the American South, well, imagine that, but magnified to an even greater extent on a nationwide level. So you can actually see how signs were written in both English and the Afrikaans language, which is related to Dutch, down there at the bottom. A picture of a segregated beach. Signs like this would have been seen literally all over the place. Again, trespassing. If you had somebody that was non-white that trespassed on a white person's property, oftentimes that person it'd be shoot to kill on sight, with really no government punishments to the perpetrator whatsoever. The government under apartheid was even so extreme that things like mass deportations of people born in South Africa were very, very common. So you see, this newspaper headline over here in 1982, the government of South Africa literally rounded up over 1 million Black South Africans and just dumped them in Swaziland. So again, this kind of thing, this just massive disruption to daily existence, something that was very commonplace for a 50-year period of time. Now, of course, there was some level of opposition and resistance to apartheid throughout this era. The main group responsible for resisting apartheid was a group called the African National Congress, or often I've just simply referred to as the ANC. And the ANC, probably one of its most notable leaders in this fight against injustice was a young lawyer by the name of Nelson Mandela. So many of you have probably heard of Nelson Mandela, a very famous world figure. Well, there's a picture of Mandela early on in his legal career as he starts to try to legally fight against apartheid. Now, Mandela was somebody that, did, sometimes you'll hear people that make criticisms of him. People say, oh, well, he's a communist, or, oh, he was a terrorist and a militant. Well, early on, during like the 1940s, 1950s, Mandela, did meet with people that were communists, did seek support from the Soviet Union, did discuss things like importing arms to physically fight against apartheid. But at the end of the day, what we see is that Mandela ends up kind of distancing himself from more extreme components of the ANC, more extreme members of the ANC, and instead he really starts to study Gandhi and civil disobedience and non-compliance with the law, and he becomes somebody that really becomes synonymous with a peaceful struggle against injustice all over the world. So somebody who you could say kind of turned things around and became a great example to humanity. Now, where we see kind of resistance really first, I guess, make its mark, one of the first really notable events that kind of gets some level of worldwide awareness was something called the Sharpeville Massacre, which happened in March of 1960. The background of the Sharpeville Massacre was that basically, Sharpeville was a large one of these homelands. You can see located a rural area near some mountains off in the distance there. And what had happened in Sharpeville was on that day, there was a large stage protest by the Black inhabitants against the pass laws. And so basically you had a few thousand people that got together and they were kind of marching through the town. And then they started to congregate outside the main police building there and just kind of, sing songs, hold signs, kind of chant things together. And basically this crowd of a few thousand people stay there outside the police station for a number of hours. Well, what ends up happening is that, first of all, as time progresses, the crowd grows larger and larger in size. It gets to be around lunchtime. A lot of people come home from work and kind of gravitate to this meeting. So the number raises from 5,000 protesters to a crowd of about 20,000 protesters fairly rapidly. The other thing is that, it starts getting warmer as the day proceeds. People start getting hungry. You start getting a little bit more hostility emerging from the crowd. And then people start to throw rocks. People start to try to break out the windows of the police station, and people start to push up against, the metal fences outside of the police station. And when that happens, the police come out. They go into the crowd to try to arrest one of these stone throwers. The crowd tries to defend the stone thrower that's being detained. There's some pushing back and forth, and then the police open fire. And by the end of that afternoon, something like 69 people end up being killed, and over 180 people end up being wounded. Now, why I bring up Sharpeville whatsoever, why this is kind of an important turning point, is that after the Sharpeville massacre, we see additional protests in townships and homelands all over the country. And I think many people thought that, oh, well, we'll just do civil disobedience, and then we'll be thrown in prison. We'll fill up the prisons. Well, the South African police and government did arrest thousands of people, and they did fill up the prisons, and they just didn't care. So this really marks a very brutal, pronounced clampdown by apartheid authorities. With this, over 18,000 members of the ANC, including much of its core leadership, are arrested. Another picture there of the police wading into the crowd. And Mandela himself, actually 2 years after this, so he ends up on the run, secretly hiding place to place. Well, 2 years later, he's captured, and he is then sent to the main prison for political prisoners in South Africa, a place called Robben Island. And I always say, basically Robben Island is like taking Alcatraz and then pumping it full of steroids. I mean, this thing's located about a mile off the coast. We're talking great white shark infested waters. There was no escape from Robben Island. So Mandela ends up spending 28 years of his life, 1962 to 1990, cooped up without representation. The South African government actually was thinking of executing him at first, but then there was some worldwide outcry, and so they didn't. And so him and thousands of others, really without a fair trial, were imprisoned for much of their adult lives. And probably one of the most famous pictures of Mandela, one that I've always found to be very powerful, is this picture of him returning to Robben Island after he became the first Black president of South Africa. And what does he do? He walks into the same prison cell where he spent 28 years, and he walks over and puts his arm up on that windowsill and stares out at the sea. And to me, it always strikes me, I always ask myself, how many hours, how many days do you think that man spent in that exact same pose, looking at that same stretch of island? So again, an image that has always been kind of powerful to me. So anyway, again, kind of back to the timeline here. So you get this 1960 event, you get this killing, you get this major government crackdown, and nothing really happens for a solid then 16 years. Things kind of remain status quo, and for the non-white peoples of South Africa, you could argue things get far worse. Well, where we start to see kind of the first bits of change, or the first seeds of change, is in 1976 with something called the Soweto riots. Now, big picture, one thing I want to say here before I get into these kind of interrelated events is that apartheid does not end because of anything that's going on within South Africa. Okay, that's something I want to be very clear. It's not like there's boycotts that cause the government to change. It's not like there's civil strife that if it was only internal issues, apartheid would probably still be going on to this day. But what happens is that as these events become more numerous, as these kind of atrocities make their way into the news, and the news stories kind of pile up one after the other. What it does is it creates a huge amount of international awareness. And it is very much international pressure, especially international economic pressure on South Africa that eventually causes the white dominated government to kind of throw up their arms and say, okay, we can't do this anymore. We're broke. We're a pariah state. Nobody wants to have any relations with us whatsoever. We need to change for our own good. Well, Soweto is kind of the first step toward that. Basically, what happens in Soweto, stands for Southwestern Township. So it was one of these townships located outside of Johannesburg that was created for Black workers. So you can see this picture down here in the bottom of what Soweto looked like basically after it was first built. And this was very typical. They come into an area, they bulldoze it, and they would just build thousands and thousands of the same exact kind of uniform house. And then they would dump a bunch of Black residents there. With Soweto, what had happened was in 1974, 2 years prior to this, there had been a law passed by the Apartheid government that required a 50-50 mix of instruction in Black schools between English and Afrikaans, two languages that were frankly not their native languages. So the Soweto riots start off with basically a protest by thousands of young students demanding that they receive some instruction in their native language and about their native cultures. So you can see this picture over here on the right of all these children in their school uniforms marching around peacefully in protest of this language against this language law. Well, eventually, after an hour or two of this march going on, police patrol arrives. Again, some students end up throwing stones, and the police end up firing into the crowd, killing 23 kids. And probably the most enduring image from the Soweto riots is this one over here on the left, which shows, a boy and his sister carrying his young dead brother, probably elementary school age, who had been killed by police. Well, this killing of kids sets off just massive riots that night throughout Soweto. Those riots end up spreading to other townships and homelands all across the country. In the next few weeks in Soweto alone, something like 500 people are killed, over 1,000 are wounded, and the rioting continues to some extent around the country for the next 6 months. So we're talking here 6 months of news reports that are leaking out to the world almost on a daily basis and appearing in the world press. It makes people kind of start to say, well, what the heck's going on in South Africa? What's the issue here? I think especially here in the United States too, you figure the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act was only about, 10, 12 years in the rearview mirror by this point. So I think a lot of Americans saw this as a parallel to their own situation and kind of took this up as an international cause to try to champion that we need to help change things in South Africa. So then here's another picture. This one shows part of Soweto today. And again, images of this are very common in former townships and homelands all over the country. Well, the next step then in kind of ratcheting up international attention, the very next year, 1977, September of that year specifically, you had the killing of a Black journalist and writer by the name of Stephen Biko. And Biko, the thing to mention about him is that Biko was not, some big notable figure. He was not, an ANC leader. He was not somebody that had any kind of international or nationwide recognition. Basically, he lived in, a certain homeland, and, he was a well-liked, charismatic figure in that homeland. But he published like a secret newspaper where he would report on conditions as they really were and wouldn't censor anything. And, the police had obviously arrested him multiple times, and, he had been warned against this kind of thing. And eventually one night in September, they raid his house. They destroy all of his publishing equipment, and then they bring him to the nearby police station in Port Elizabeth. And what ends up happening, and we only know this, many, many years later, we get kind of the full story, is that they bring him to this police station. They interrogate him in a small room. They torture him. The thing that comes out many years later, when this is all documented, is that they actually had beat him many, many times with a hose, specifically with like the metal end of a garden hose. They'd been throwing him into a wall. They had been, bashing his head and hands into a desk. And then after, beating him for hours in this interrogation room, they then throw him in a jail cell and they go home for the night. Well, the next morning, police come back and they find that Stephen Biko is not moved whatsoever, that he was basically unresponsive, still had a pulse, still was breathing, but basically unresponsive. And they then throw him in the back of a police car and drive something like, 100 miles down a bumpy dirt road to the nearest hospital. Well, by the time he gets there, they find out that he had major internal hemorrhaging and the guy's dead. Well, again, why this story is kind of notable is that, stuff like this, frankly, happened all the time in South Africa. This was a very common story. And anytime it would happen, the government, the police would just issue some statement that, he died of natural conditions in the jail cell. And it would be kind of swept under the rug and the rest of the world would have no idea about it whatsoever. It would all be covered up. Well, in the case of Biko, there was actually a white journalist that was friends with Biko, a man by the name of Donald Woods. And Donald Woods, finds out about this and he hears about Biko's death and he says, this is kind of fishy. I'm going to look into this. And so he does this like major kind of secret investigation, finds out the true story, writes it all up as this like big article, big news report, and then he personally sneaks it out of the country. And so when this story is published, it's just this like captivating kind of story. It has it all. It has the adventure and the investigation, and here this Donald Woods guy is fleeing for his own life, and I think what it does is it really creates a vivid story of injustice and struggle in the minds of many people around the world. I put up here then on this particular slide the lyrics of a famous song by by a recording artist, Peter Gabriel. Some of you might be familiar with Peter Gabriel. He was originally the lead singer in Genesis at one point and then kind of went out on his own. But Peter Gabriel, ends up kind of latching on to the story, as do many celebrity figures, and ends up writing this song. And you look at the lyrics of this song, and it basically tells you the story of Stephen Biko. So I actually have this song personally on my Best of Peter Gabriel CD, which is sitting right near me here in my house. Another media example of this story also that kind of publicizes it and publicizes apartheid to all walks of American life was in 1984. While apartheid is still going on, a Hollywood movie comes out starring a young Denzel Washington, and I forget the name of this famous actor, called Cry Freedom. And I remember one time reading an essay where the author of the essay made a statement. He said, Denzel Washington probably did as much, Cry Freedom probably did as much to end apartheid as any other single person. Because millions of Americans went to the movie theater, watched this movie, were kind of stirred emotionally by it, and then called up their congressman and demanded action, or took part in public protests here in the United States demanding action. And so it's this public outcry that causes the American government to start to take decisive steps. Another guy, also during the same time period, the 1980s, that becomes a huge part of rallying the world against the apartheid regime, was the man that you see pictured here, Mr. Desmond Tutu. And Tutu, you can kind of see just based on what he's wearing in this picture, was a member of the Anglican clergy. So he was actually a black archbishop of the Anglican Church, aka the Church of England. And since he was a high-ranking member of the clergy of a religious denomination directly connected to the United Kingdom, he had a lot of freedoms and a lot of leeway that other black South Africans did not have. He could travel internationally. He could, give public speeches that were not censored. He would not be thrown in prison. He would not be tortured because, the apartheid government knew, hey, we arrest this guy connected to the Church of England, the British people are going to flip out. And so what he starts to do is he starts to use his position as a way to travel around the world, to meet with other politicians and go to different countries to give public speeches and sermons where he says, listen, the only way to end this is to make this hurt for white South Africans. I ask you, like, cut off trade, enact embargoes. Like, yes, it's going to hurt Black South Africans financially as well, but we already struggle financially, so do it. Make it painful. Only then will they change. And Desmond Tutu actually ends up winning the Nobel Peace Prize eventually in 1984 for his efforts. And what ends up happening kind of little by little then over the next few years is, South Africa is banned from pretty much all international sporting competitions. So they're kicked out of the Olympics. They're kicked out of the World Cup. There's all sorts of trade embargoes and trade sanctions that are put in place, weapons embargoes, etc. And it does take a toll. So I put this picture up here because one thing I want you to understand is I don't want you to think that all white South Africans were supportive of apartheid. Okay, there was a lot that were not supportive of apartheid, but especially as it economically starts to hit, white protests against apartheid in South Africa also become way more common. That, hey, I'm down 20% in my bank account this year compared to last year because businesses are hurting because of these international embargoes. We need to change. We need to get these sanctions lifted. Well, it's in part because of this international pressure that what we see in 1990 specifically is that things start to very drastically and rapidly change. Specifically in late 1989, you had a presidential election that occurred in South Africa in which a man by the name of F.W. de Klerk was elected president. And F.W. de Klerk, a little bit of background about him. I mean, you can just tell based on his name, he's of Afrikaner, Dutch descent. He was somebody that was a member of that ruling National Party. He was somebody who had made his political career supporting apartheid and racism. And yet, after getting elected president, first thing he does is he says, okay, we need to start to reevaluate these laws. We need to start to kind of roll them back for our own good, little by little. So F.W. de Klerk is one of these guys who I always say is one of the heroes of this story that oftentimes gets overlooked because it at the end of the day, it took people within the government. It was de Klerk that was convincing other lawmakers that, hey, we need to vote on this law to rescind some of these older acts. Well, you see that one of the early things that he ends up doing is he orders the release of Nelson Mandela. He orders the release of all of these political prisoners all over the country. There is major negotiation then that takes place between Mandela and de Klerk and the ANC and the National Party over the next few years about, well, what are things going to look like in South Africa moving forward? Like if we're going to dismantle apartheid, it's not going to fix everything overnight. There's going to be people on both sides. There's going to be extremists on both sides that aren't going to like this. What can we do? Because there's a lot of people around the world that feared that the end of apartheid would lead to civil war in South Africa, that the blacks would want revenge and would take the land and drive out the whites. There was a lot of people that were members of, you could say, white terrorist groups that were doing bombings and assassinations, trying to disrupt the whole peace process. But sure enough, they managed to kind of keep things on track. And so you see 1993, these guys jointly win the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts. And in 1994, then, you have the first true democratic elections held in South Africa. And, images like this, I remember this vividly. I was 12 years old when this occurred. I remember seeing this on the news. I mean, literally, you would have voting lines in some of these rural homelands that would stretch for miles. And again, there's threats of white terrorist attacks, on these voting facilities. And yet the people still showed up and they overwhelmingly voted for Nelson Mandela, who then became the first non-white ruler of the South African state. Now, Mandela, part of the reason why he gets, so universally praised as this great person is from pretty much day one in office, he promotes reconciliation and forgiveness as kind of official policy. A great example of this, there was a Hollywood movie made about a number of years ago called Invictus. There's also if you're into ESPN, there's a great ESPN 30 for 30 documentary about this as well. That I think it was 94, maybe 95, that South Africa ends up hosting the Rugby World Cup. And rugby had been the sport of the whites. And yet, as an olive branch, as a show of forgiveness, he says, what, we're going to host this big competition in South Africa for basically this all-white team and for the white population. Really cool story. Another thing that he does is he sets up something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he appoints Desmond Tutu to head this. And basically what it was is if you were somebody that, was involved in the government or involved in the police or in the military or anybody at all, and you had committed crimes during that 50-year apartheid era, if you came forward and went on record and you came forward and you told your story, you were then granted a full amnesty. You were forgiven. Like, you would never be punished. You would never be thrown in jail. You'd never be fined, anything at all. So again, a lot of what we know of atrocities like, the Stephen Biko beating is only because you'd have these people, oftentimes, vile racists that would come forward. I remember reading I forget if it was a book or an essay by Tutu when I was in college, where he talked about, you get these policemen that would come up and they would hock a loogie in his face and say, oh, I think that you're dirt, I hate your type. And then they would go and sit there and talk all about all the terrible things that they had done. And Tutu would then turn around and say, okay, you're forgiven. We got you. You're good. I mean, it's stuff that I think would be very difficult for the vast majority of people around the world to swallow. Now, as a kind of closing remark, so apartheid now is, been over for more than 25 years. Kind of hard to think about it. But of course, there are still major problems in South Africa today. Still, there's a massive gap between black and whites in terms of opportunities, education levels, standard of living. I saw a report from the early 2000s, I think it was 2005, that stated that the average white family in South Africa makes something like 6 times as much income-wise as your average black family. 40% of the black population in the early 2000s unemployed. 60% black South Africans live below the poverty line. AIDS, HIV rates extremely high in the black population compared to the white population. One of the other things that we've seen is that, that group, the ANC, Mandela's party, now Mandela's, since retired, passed away, etc. But his party has remained in such firm control of the government that we've started to see significant corruption within the government of South Africa as well. So, today, South Africa, on paper, one of the larger economies on the African continent, but it's going to take probably generations for a lot of the problems from this era are 100% fixed.